Interlake Eastman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and just want to let you know that I'll be splitting my time with my colleague from Sarnia and Lapton. It is indeed an honor to be able to get up and speak on this motion that's been brought forward by my friend from Calgary Nose Hill and amended by my colleague from Calgary Shepherd. It is unfortunate, though, that we have to have this debate today, knowing that so many Canadians understand the atrocities that have been committed against the Yazidi people. When you look at what happened 2 years ago in Sinjar, Iraq, and how ISIS targeted the Yazidis community and carried out one of the most brutal genocides that have been witnessed in Canadian recent history, or in world recent history. We saw men executed at gunpoint. We saw children crucified by ISIS. And we saw the people, the Yazidis people, being trapped on Mount Sinjar, that many perished from dehydration, the elderly collapsed and died, and ultimately, after the execution of men over the age of 10, the younger boys were moved into the terrorist training and were reprogrammed and brainwashed and turned into suicide bombers and terrorists. And of course, the women and the girls were sold into sexual slavery. Those that refused to convert, those girls and women that refused to be sexual slaves, were burnt alive. These atrocities are just so despicable that the world pronounced themselves as a genocide. I'd like to remind the House, Mr. Speaker, that it was only in June that we had before the Chamber a debate on a motion that the official opposition brought forward to recognize the atrocities being committed by ISIS against the Yazidis as genocide. And of course, the government, the Liberal Party, voted against it. And only a couple of days later, the UN declared it a genocide. And only then, rather than leading, the Liberals decide to follow the United Nations. When the rest of the world, the British House of Commons, Secretary of State John Kerry in the United States, all had already boldly proclaimed it a genocide, as did our former Conservative government. Now, the sad part in all this is that we're debating the motion today to look at bringing more Yazidi refugees into Canada. And we have a government that is very proud of their record of bringing in, or are going to bring in, 25,000 refugees from Syria and Iraq. The sad part of this is that out of the thousands of refugees that have come to Canada for asylum, only 9 of them are Yazidi. And that is, in my opinion, despicable. And I'm certain it has to be an embarrassment for the government. And I really do have to raise this question, is why hasn't the government gone out and brought in more of these poor women and girls who are in refugee camps already in the region, who have been already identified by the United Nations refugee organization, and brought them here? Are they discriminating against the Yazidi people? That has to be asked. When you have, Mr. Speaker, these people who have been subjected to treatment worse than livestock by ISIS and largely abandoned by some of the people in the region in northern Iraq, they deserve asylum. They deserve a place to call home. And I know for a fact that organizations across Canada are prepared to privately sponsor them. I know that the Winnipeg Jewish Foundation and Federation in Manitoba is wanting to sponsor these poor Yazidi girls and women and get them into a safe and secure environment that we offer here in Canada. And we are giving, through the amended motion, we are giving the government 120 days to act upon the United Nations Commission of Inquiry on Syria, entitled, "They Came to Destroy ISIS's Crimes Against the Yazidis." It's implementing articles in sections 210, 212, and 213 of the report. And as my colleague from Calgary Nose Hill, the immigration critic for the official opposition, has already said in a written letter to the Minister of Immigration and Citizenship, that he can use Section 25 of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act to expedite the asylum seekers of the Yazidi community that are currently in the queue to come here. As it's already been pointed out, Mr. Speaker, Britain, Germany, Australia, and others have been able to bring in hundreds of these girls and women who have been able to escape the sexual slavery, who have been able to get away from ISIS, who often their jihadists hang on to them, their militants hang on to them as, comfort wives. It's something that we haven't seen since World War II, which was practiced by the Japanese during World War II. But I'm glad that there's been the opportunity for us to at least address this issue in the House today, because I don't think most Canadians realize that the government, in their efforts to bring in all of the refugees that have been displaced and targeted by ISIS, have not included the Yazidis in their efforts to bring them here. I know that when we were government, Mr. Speaker, that it was our intention to go after the ethnic and religious minorities who were the primary source of the atrocities being committed, or the primary target of atrocities to be committed by ISIS themselves. And if we are going to ultimately protect people, if the government believes in the responsibility to protect, one, we have to have that military force there. Two, we have to provide the humanitarian aid and assistance, which we're going to need right now as the battle for Mosul evolves and 1.5 million civilians are at risk inside the city of Mosul as 30,000 coalition troops charge the city to rout out and destroy ISIS and roughly their 5,000 fighters that they have within the city. Yes, we have to be able to support surrounding nations that have those refugee camps, providing humanitarian assistance, schools, water, hospital, medicines. But what about the responsibility to protect those that can't protect themselves? What about the responsibility to bring in those that have been subjected to a genocide? And I've talked many times in this House on genocide and how Raphael Lemkin, the wordsmith and the author of the UN Genocide Convention back in 1948, developed it, and how different state players and different organizations and groups will target minorities to eliminate them. And the UN, just this June, agreed again that what has happened to the Yazidis people specifically was a genocide. And if there's ever a time for the government to show compassion, if there's ever a time for the government to use their powers under the Immigration, Refugee, and Protection Act to expedite the movement of these poor girls and women away from danger and bring them into the peace and security that we offer here in Canada, this is the time. We're asking them to do that within the next 120 days, to follow through on the UN report and recommendations from the United Nations, and to support this motion as it stands before the House.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, so thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate what it is that the member is saying across the way. What I guess I would ask for is that the opposition recognize that as a government, we have taken a very proactive approach in dealing with the refugee issue. And it's, Mr. Speaker, something in which we take very seriously. Right from the Prime Minister's office to the responsible ministers, in terms of making sure not only that we get the job done, but that in fact that we get it done right. The horrific actions that are being taken place overseas is in fact very upsetting for all of us, for all sides of this House. But my question to the member is, would he not acknowledge that at the very least, and I think that we've demonstrated this with the Syrian refugees, Mr. Speaker, in terms of just the large number of refugees, and we've been complimented around the world for Canada's approach in dealing with the Syrian refugee crisis, that at times you have to go through a process, and there is concerns in regards to the timing amongst a couple of other things with respect to the resolution. But specifically that there needs to be a proper processing to ensure that it's done right, and we have to work with our coalition partners as much as possible so that we can maximize the benefits for as many as possible.
The honourable member for Selkirk, Interlake, Eastman.
Well, the question really is for the government and for my friend from Winnipeg North. You know, why is the government not acting upon the United Nations recommendations 210, 212, and 213 on actually bringing in and accelerating the protection of Yazidis, girls and women? You know, this has been a recommendation since June, and yet we still see foot dragging by the government. This is a chance for them to actually stand up for a major group that has been targeted and essentially almost eliminated and exterminated by ISIS. But instead, they're discriminating against them. So I urge my colleague to get behind this motion and ask the government to actually implement the recommendations by the United Nations, who they love very dearly, and accelerate the immigration and protection of these refugees.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Kitchener-Conestoga.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague for not only his leadership on this issue, but on the many issues that are relating to our foreign affairs. My colleague mentioned earlier in his speech that in June of this year, the Conservative Party, put forward a motion, and the Liberal Party voted against it, in terms of simply declaring the Yazidi situation a genocide.
Exactly.
And even on that point of simply making a declaration, the Liberal Party failed to act. Does my colleague think that part of the problem maybe is simply acknowledging that there is a problem before we can begin to take action, and would he urge them to get on with it?
They're the
Thank
problem.
you.
Honourable member for Selkirk, Interlake, Eastman.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my friend for his question. And, you know, it is very disheartening to see the government refuse to recognize this first as a genocide. You know, we brought that motion forward on June 9th. A couple of days later, we had the vote on it, and they voted against it. And then, you know, June 15th is when the report came out from ISIS, or it came out from the UN, that ISIS was committing genocide against the Yazidi peoples. So it is disheartening that they love to talk like they're out there and supporting responsibility to protect. They're out there and addressing these humanitarian crises. They like to denounce, you know, historical genocides. But at the same time, we have a genocide before us today that they can do something about, and they decide to sit on their hands instead. And to me, that is deplorable.
Resuming debate.